authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing on the Oversight hearing on federal efforts to combat human trafficking. I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you'd like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members, both those in person and those attending remotely, to please mute your microphones when you are speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. We look forward to moving quickly. Let me, as I recognize myself, acknowledge today of the funeral services for our late former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, of whom we have the greatest respect and honor for her service to this nation. She was a great American and a great patriot. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing will focus on federal efforts to combat human trafficking. At the onset, I must stress that human trafficking and human smuggling are two different crimes. Human trafficking involves the victimization of adults, youth, and children for the purposes of performing labor, commercial sex acts, and other services. It can happen anywhere in America, in rural communities, in the form of agricultural labor, in urban communities in the form of massage parlors, and suburban communities in the form of domestic labor, or in any combination. The public's perception of human trafficking is dangerously flawed. While we may be tempted to believe human trafficking happens only in foreign countries, where people are grabbed off the street and thrown into a car, or victims are moved from one place to another under the cover of night, the reality is that human trafficking can occur anywhere in the United States, including in a victim's own home. Human smuggling is a business of transporting people illegally across an international border. Human smuggling, unlike human trafficking, does not involve coercion. The people smugglers bring from one place to another illegally generally have chosen to make the trip, sometimes under false pretenses, but they made that decision themselves for any number of reasons. Some are fleeing violence or poverty. Human trafficking, by contrast, is involuntary. Smuggling people across international borders is equally troubling crime, but distinct from human trafficking. With human smuggling, the victim is the United States, and with human trafficking, the victims are the women, men, youth, and children who are treated like modern-day slaves. Human trafficking and the scourge of human trafficking and the eliminating of human trafficking is close to my heart. This is a very important hearing for me, very important for the witnesses that are here. And I know the sacrifice that survivors are making to even testify. And so my commitment to you is that we are working to ensure that we are seen as a country that is fighting to eliminate the scourge of human trafficking. As I said, human smugglers of people who come for justice, business, economic opportunity, we understand that. But human smugglers ignore and evade our immigration laws. They must be prosecuted, and the exploitation of their victims must not go unpunished. As I'm sure we will hear from our witnesses today, human traffickers are typically subtle and charismatic. They may sometimes be family members or acquaintances. They befriend their targets and coax and coerce them into signing up for work or selling their bodies. And although some populations are at greater risk than others, human trafficking spans all races, ages, genders, and every socioeconomic status. Take, for instance, the Honorable Courtney Lipback, a courageous young woman from my state of Texas who is here with us today. Courtney, this is her story. She has spread or has the understanding of a very deep and important message. Courtney has made it her mission to tell her story and speak out to spread awareness about human trafficking and help shape policy to protect other young people from falling victim to the schemes of human traffickers and to hold traffickers accountable. Courtney first became entangled in sex trafficking when she was still in high school. Despite what some believe about victims of human trafficking, she grew up in a loving, church-going family in a safe neighborhood and attended an upscale suburban high school in Texas. But by the age of 18, she was being sold for sex on websites like Backpage.com. Courtney was a junior in high school when a series of traumatic experiences occurred, leaving her emotionally susceptible and in a downward spiral. Like so many victims of human trafficking, she began participating in high-risk behaviors driven by the traffickers, including using drugs and alcohol. A trafficker with ties to her high school used fellow students to prey upon her and use her vulnerabilities to their advantage, offering her friendship and support when they felt she had none, meanwhile drawing her gradually into the life. How tragic for so many of our young people. A groomer chatted with her through social media and other apps for almost a year. She grew to trust this person who was a friend of a friend. He picked her up from the school one day, and Courtney soon realized that this person she thought she loved meant to pass her on to a trafficker for a finder's fee. But it is tragic that this goes on every single day around schools. Because of stories like Courtney's last week, I introduced the Stop Human Trafficking in School Zone Act, a bipartisan bill, which will create a sentencing enhancement of up to 5 additional years imprisonment for commission of the offense of child sex trafficking on or within 1,000 feet of a school or premises in which a school-sponsored activity is taking place, to ensure that schools are a safe haven for students. That trafficking bill is H.R. 7566. Eventually, Courtney would be transported from Texas to California, then Las Vegas, passing from the clutches of one trafficker to another. The coercive tactics of her captors varied from subtle to overt, physical to psychological, from violent to caring. Occasion when she attempted to reach out, officials treated her like a criminal, convincing her that the safest place for her might be with the trafficker. Traffickers can make themselves like their family or friends and deceive people. States have made great strides in curtailing the criminalization of human trafficking victims through various measures. The state of Texas has been one of them, even though Houston has been the epicenter of trafficking, such as ending the practice of arresting children for prostitution, enacting safe harbor laws, vacating adjudications and convictions, offering expungement or sealing of arrest records, and codifying affirmative defenses to certain offenses. This goes across many states in the United States. But it is time for the federal government to catch up and do the same. We must correct past wrongs that have left victims bound to criminal records they never deserved. I'm glad my ranking member has even indicated that we should do this in a bipartisan manner. People who have been trafficked, whether for labor or sex, are not criminals. There are victims who deserve victim-focused, culturally informed responses that direct them towards services critical to sustaining them as they heal and are able to get away from the criminal justice system. Fortunately, Courtney escaped her final trafficker in 2018, a cause of celebration, but the pain almost never leaves. She sought counseling, started a nonprofit with her mother, and in 2020, she was appointed to the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. I'd like Courtney Litvak to please stand up. Thank you. In that same year, Texas had the second highest reported cases of human trafficking. An estimated 25% of human trafficking victims in the United States are in Texas. While we tend to focus on sex trafficking, we must do more to shine a light on the incidences of labor trafficking and victims of forced labor. This begins with gathering better data. There are a reported 234,000 victims of labor trafficking in Texas at any given time. We need to know who these victims are, where they are, and what they need, not only in Texas, but across the country. We must continue to shape legislation to help answer these questions, to better understand the problem we are trying to solve, which leads me to the central purpose of today's hearing. I am confident that our witnesses today will provide insightful recommendations for how we can improve upon the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, the cornerstone of the U.S. anti-trafficking response, as well as other legislation and programming aimed at preventing human trafficking, protecting victims and survivors, including the Anti-Trafficking in School Zones Act, just indicated earlier. I'm sure we can agree that we must better support victims of labor and sex trafficking. I want to continue having legislation that enhances treating those victims and continuing with them for a period of time, ensure that they are not re-victimized or stigmatized, and provide them with services that help them successfully reintegrate into society. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses. Thank our survivor experts for their bravery and your willingness to share your stories. I cannot thank you enough. I'm certain that our discussions today will lead us to solutions that will help more survivors reach the place of healing that we find these courageous people before us today. Without objection, I will submit into the record the following documents: written testimony of James L. Dole, JD CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids, joint written testimony of Michelle Guyman, Probation Director for Los Angeles County Probation Department, and Kate Walker-Brown, Senior Director of the National Center for Youth Law, and a statement from Courtney Lipvac to be subsequently prospectively submitted without objection. I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you for holding this very important hearing on this critical topic, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here, particularly those who have been victimized by human or sex trafficking. This hearing is titled Oversight of Federal Efforts to Combat Human Trafficking, but I feel we're missing one element. I hope that we recover that maybe in a subsequent hearing, because we don't have a government witness today. I think we should have someone from the federal government today to testify, because we need them to participate. We need to hold their feet to the fire in overseeing this important topic. And I believe every other Republican on the subcommittee would welcome an opportunity to interact with a Biden administration official so we can do that proper oversight. In fact, I've sent several letters to the chair, and I would ask that they be included into the record without objection, if that's okay, Madam Chair.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Human trafficking is a terrible crime and should be taken very seriously. The estimated annual global profits from human trafficking are approximately $150 billion a year. And one of the areas where human trafficking and human smuggling is the most prevalent is on our southwestern border. The failed policies of this administration encourage and facilitate Mexican drug cartels, transnational criminal organizations, and other malevolent actors to engage in human trafficking and smuggling across our southwestern border. Every single day, traffickers from cartels and criminal organizations exploit our southwestern border. According to CBP, a report they made February of last year, traffickers made a total of $411 million in the month of February alone. Cartels and other criminal organizations charge up to $5,000 to smuggle children across the border and more than $10,000 to smuggle adults. And traffickers will often promise migrants a better future and a better paying job, but in reality, they are deceiving them into a life of indentured servitude, sex trafficking, or forced work to pay off their debts. Last year, the Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit opened investigations into locations in Alabama and Oregon due to concerns of labor trafficking. The DOJ's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit director stated, quote, "Some of these situations appear to involve dozens of unaccompanied minors all being released to the same sponsor and then exploited for labor in poultry processing or similar industries," close quote. One couple in Alabama has already been convicted of money laundering and conspiracy to transport illegal aliens. At the border, our federal law enforcement are simply outnumbered. They don't have the resources necessary to address the problem that has been created in this administration. After HHS placed a UAC with a sponsor, case managers are supposed to call it's called a well-being follow-up call to determine if an unaccompanied child who has been placed by Health and Human Services is safe and if the sponsors are complying with their responsibilities. This February, HHS informed me that, quote, there are 19,726 sponsors who could not be reached. Think about that. That means that HHS cannot verify the safety or well-being of nearly 20,000 children who've been placed in the charge of this government. We don't know where their sponsors are. It means we don't know where those children are. Because of a loophole created by the TVPRA, DHS is required to turn over unaccompanied children from non-contiguous countries to HHS so they can place these unaccompanied children with sponsors, and yet we can't keep track of 20,000 of them. We've lost track of 20,000. This particular policy is a magnet that leads to parents sending their children to the U.S. alone, knowing that they will be released. In a recent trip to the border, I know, and I'm giving you numbers and I'm giving you dollar amounts, but everything that I'm talking about includes a face of some innocent victim. So on one recent trip to the southern border, I met with an agent, and we talked about this particular issue, children being trafficked. Excuse me. The agent took from him his pocket, cell phone, and he said, Andy, here's a 4-year-old, came across yesterday. Here's a 3-year-old. Here's a 7-year-old with a 3-year-old. The 7-year-old was responsible for the 3-year-old. This happens every day on this border. Every day. It's inhumane, and it is a failure of this government. So I have introduced legislation that will close the loophole. And I hope all my colleagues on this subcommittee will join me in closing that loophole. In March of this year, there were 221,303 illegal alien encounters at the southwestern border, the highest monthly total in 22 years, and that number is expected to get worse. If Title 42 is rescinded, even DHS has said that's 18,000 encounters daily. That will be a floor, not even a ceiling. In February of this year, 8,565 individuals were paroled, and an additional 55,000 individuals were released into the United States. When I was in Yuma, on one of my border trips, they related to me an incident that took place. They had discovered, looking in their database and tracking, that at one particular address in Charleston, South Carolina, was the sponsor for just a numerous amount of individuals coming into to that address. So they would apprehend these folks, and then they would release them, but a lot of them were going to the same address in South Carolina, which seems suspicious because, you know, that's not usual. Usually you have different sponsors. They conducted an investigation, and what they found was using cross-state, multiple state agencies and federal agencies, they found in a mobile home in Charleston, South Carolina, a young girl of approximately age 11 or 12 caring for 2 younger boys in a mobile home. Those children, her job was, they made her stay in there and care for those 2 children. Those children were then returned to Yuma repeatedly to create a false family unit for quicker release from the border. They were being trafficked and used as chattels instead of human beings and not being properly cared for. This is an ongoing problem. Detroit, FBI office in Detroit, just last week released an important report warning us about increased threat of sexploitation and online exploitation. This is in Detroit just last week. This is an ongoing crisis. It is a criminal crisis, criminal justice crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis as well. Today, our witnesses that I've invited are Sheriff Mark Daniels from Cochise County, Arizona. Sheriff Daniels is on the border. It is a huge county, about the same size as the state of Rhode Island. He and his deputies are dealing with the impacts of this border crisis on a daily basis. They're overwhelmed by the cartels that transport drugs and traffic human beings across that border. Sheriff Daniels is operating and taking it upon himself to act when the federal government has failed to act. And he will share with us what they've done to interdict human trafficking and drug trafficking and sex trafficking in place of the federal government, and how Cochise County is making his county is making a difference. Jessica Vaughan is the Director of Policy Studies at Center for Immigration Studies. She's an expert in immigration enforcement policy and public safety, and will help explain how the current policies implemented by Secretary Mayorkas have created the worst border crisis in our history, which includes the exploitation and trafficking of hundreds of thousands of individuals in the last 15 months. I also want to introduce, for the record, and coming from Arizona, I have multiple pictures of signs like this, but it indicates, again, a failure of the federal government. And I don't point to any administration in this case, because it is a huge problem in Arizona. This particular sign says smuggling and illegal immigration may be encountered in this area. An additional sign, which I won't submit for the record, but I would submit that for the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. An additional sign which was placed there in a different area in Arizona's desert is this: active drug and human smuggling area. Visitors may encounter armed criminals and smuggling vehicles traveling at high rates of speed. Stay away. If that is the best we can do, we are an abject failure. That, Madam Chair, I look forward to working with you and continuing our efforts to eradicate human smuggling and human trafficking and sex trafficking. And I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I think it's important to just take note of the fact that relatively few trafficking victims are taken across an international border into the United States. Most of them are U.S. citizens. San Diego, for example, found that 80% of those that were in their area, 450 of them, were in the United States. So we know that we will be addressing this question. We are not ignoring it. We'll be addressing this question with the pending hearings that will be coming going forward. But I want to make sure as well, as I described human trafficking, that the United States is front and center on ending that scourge here in the United States and the many victims all over the nation. So thank you. I look forward to you looking at H.R. 7566. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing on human trafficking. Too often, we think of human trafficking as something that happens somewhere else, in other cities and in other countries, and not in our own communities. An unfortunate reality, however, is that human trafficking touches many more of our communities than we might suspect, from major cities to quiet suburbs. Our inability to see the harms of human trafficking allows it to persist and leaves victims vulnerable, sometimes even as they think that they have found those who will help them escape. It is important for us to be clear at the outset about the scope of this hearing. We are here today to discuss human trafficking, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provisioning, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of forced labor or forced commercial sex. This is a distinct crime from the no less serious crime of human smuggling, in which people are brought across international borders through the deliberate evasion of immigration laws. Human trafficking can and frequently does occur without crossing any borders. When human trafficking does involve border crossings, we must take care not to punish victims for their traffickers' disregard for both criminal and immigration law. When we discuss human trafficking, the headlines often focus on sex trafficking and ignore the significant harms caused by labor trafficking. Labor trafficking occurs in the United States across many different industries, including domestic work, traveling sales crews, food services, agriculture, health and beauty services, construction, hospitality, landscaping, and many others. Further, the distinction between sex trafficking and labor trafficking is not always clear. As we will hear from the survivors and experts here today, those who are forced into sex trafficking may also find themselves forced to do labor in furtherance of their traffickers' criminal activities. Meanwhile, those who are trafficked for labor are often in vulnerable situations that leave them at risk of sexual abuse. Finally, we must develop a better understanding of who is being trafficked. As we will hear from our witnesses, trafficking can victimize the young and old alike. It is not confined to one gender, race, sexual orientation, or immigration status. I hope we will hear today about how our laws can better serve the needs of all people who experience trafficking so that we can be sure all victims and survivors get the assistance that fits their individual needs. This hearing is especially important as we examine proposals to reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I hope our witnesses can help us to understand how the TVPA is helping to support the needs of victims and survivors, as well as how it can be improved. We must take appropriate steps to improve how our criminal justice system treats trafficking survivors, including ensuring that they are treated as victims of crime rather than as perpetrators. For example, we must consider whether there are sufficient avenues to correct past injustices, such as mechanisms to clear the records of those who were charged as criminals when they were, in fact, victims of trafficking. Such measures are essential to the restoration and healing process for victims who should not be saddled with a criminal record as they seek to build a new life. I thank our witnesses for being here, especially the survivors who are here to share their personal, harrowing stories of survival, escape, and hopefully healing. I hope that we can learn from their experiences so that fewer people face what they have endured and so that we can assist the many victims and survivors not before us today. I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman's time has expired. It is now my pleasure to introduce the witnesses in today's hearing. Ms. Evelyn Chumbao is a survivor of child labor. Okay, good. Is a survivor of child labor, trafficking turned anti-trafficking activist and public speaker. She was brought to the United States from Cameroon at the age of 9 and forced to cook, clean, and care for her traffickers' children. She escaped after years of captivity. Welcome. She earned a Bachelor of Science from the University of Maryland, University College, was appointed by President Obama to serve on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, and is now the Operations Manager and Survival Advocate for the Human Trafficking Legal Center and a member of the Board of Directors for Free the Slaves. Ms. Jessica Vaughan is the Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration. She is also an instructor for senior law enforcement training seminars at Northwestern University Center for Public Safety. She was formerly a Foreign Service Officer with the State Department. Ms. Vaughan earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Washington College and a Master of Arts from Georgetown University. Welcome. Ms. Shamir McKenzie is a consultant, activist, subject matter expert on human trafficking and public speaker. She is the Chief Executive Officer for Sungate Foundation. She also serves as a training manager for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, co-chair of the Victim Services Committee of the Maryland State Human Trafficking Task Force. Welcome. She received a Bachelor of Science in Criminology and Criminal Justice from Loyola University. Mr. Christian Eduardo is a survivor leader at Sanctuary for Families and a member of ECPAC USA Survivors Council. He is an advocate, speaker, and educator for immigrant and LGBTQ+ rights and anti-trafficking initiatives, including the Equality Model. Welcome. Sheriff Mark Daniels has been elected Sheriff of the Cochise County, Arizona since 2012. Sheriff Daniels is a 38-year veteran of law enforcement. He holds a master's degree in criminal justice from Aspen University and is a certified public manager from Arizona State University. He began his law enforcement career in 1984 after serving in the United States Army. Welcome, Sheriff. Mr. Terry Fitzpatrick is the director of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, often referred to as ATTEST. He has been involved with ATTEST in various capacities for more than a decade, including service as a co-chair prior to becoming director. He previously served as the Communications and Advocacy Director at Free the Slaves. Welcome. Ms. Jacqueline Alibutto is a human rights activist, anti-trafficking specialist, victims advocate, and producer, and I might add, my constituent in Houston, Texas, working very hard on these terrible issues in the state and around the nation. She is the co-founder of the No Trafficking Zone and founder of Real Beauty, Real Women. In 2020, she received the United Nations Ambassador's Pin in recognition of her service and dedication to the tenets and values upheld by the National Council of Women of the United States, founded by Susan B. Anthony. Welcome again. Ms. Martina Vandenberg is founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which she established in 2012. She has represented victims of human trafficking pro bono in various legal arenas, testified before several congressional committees, and trained more than 5,000 pro bono attorneys nationwide to handle human trafficking matters. Ms. Vandenberg previously served as a partner at Jenner & Block, a Rhodes Scholar and a Truman Scholar, and graduate of Columbia Law School. She has taught as an adjunct faculty member at the American University Washington College of Law. Welcome. We welcome our distinguished witnesses, and we thank you for their participation. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses. I ask our witnesses in person to rise, and our witnesses testifying remotely to turn on your audio and make sure that I can see your face and your raised hand while I administer the oath. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
Sheriff? Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Sheriff. All right. Is something wrong with your system? You'll get it right. You may be seated. We'll hear from you, and I'm sure you will adhere to that. Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please, as you've already done, be seated. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that same time frame, there is a timing light on your table and on your screen. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I now recognize Ms. Chumbao for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Member of the subcommittee, I'm honored to be here today to testify about the oversight of federal effort to combat human trafficking. In communities across the United States of America and throughout the world, tens of millions of people are exploited in forced labor. Labor trafficking is a heinous crime that inflicts lasting physical, psychological, emotional, and financial harm on its victims. I'm a survivor of labor trafficking. I will share with you today how the U.S. government can be part of the solution. My journey as a survivor of child labor trafficking started with a dream about coming to America. I was 10 years old. The image I had of the U.S. was from the television shows I saw, The Cosby Show, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and 90210. When I was told that I was coming to the United States to be adopted and get a better education, I was excited. I thought I could marry Will Smith, no kidding. What I did not know was that my uncle in Cameroon had actually sold me into a woman in Maryland. I became a modern-day slave, just miles from the U.S. Capitol. I cooked and cleaned and cared for her children. I would go days without eating. My trafficker beat me. She said I was so dirty that I was not allowed to sleep on a bed. I slept on the floor. I was never paid. I begged to be able to go to school, but my trafficker refused. Years later, I found out that it was my legal right to go to school. I went into foster care and finally got to attend school. In fact, I got my degree in Homeland Security from the University of Maryland University College. I now work at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I had to fight to get to where I am today. But I am an exception. Many human trafficking victims cannot rebuild their life. I'm here to share ideas on how the U.S. government can help. There are 9 recommendations in the document I have shared with you. I will briefly mention 4. Recommendation 1, improve the U.S. immigration process. I entered the country on the same passport and a visa as 4 other children. My trafficker used the same passport to bring 5 children over a period of 1 year. Recommendation 2, provide trauma-informed, victim-centered investigation. After I escaped my trafficker, I met with the federal investigators. One of them accused me of fabricating a story to get a green card and remain in the country. When investigators wanted to document the abuse I had endured, they forced me to take my clothes off in a room full of people to take pictures. This was the opposite of victim-centered, trauma-informed practice. Recommendation 3, provide trafficking survivors with a legal representation. Trafficking survivors need pro bono attorneys to work them through the entire process of their case. Too often, victims do not have their own lawyers doing the criminal case. Recommendation 4, understanding the role of racism in human trafficking. Yes, trafficking can happen to anyone, but when people are vulnerable, they are more at risk. Marginalized community of color are more likely to have this vulnerability because of systematic racism. Racism is present at all stages for survivors of color. Even after they escape their trafficking situation, they continue to face racism. Please find details of the final 5 recommendations in the document provided. In conclusion, I would like to ask everyone here today working to end human trafficking to keep this recommendation in mind. Prevention, protection, proper investigation are important when addressing all forms of trafficking. Forced labor must be on the agenda alongside sex trafficking. Survivor voices like mine here today are essential in this policy discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. The witness has yielded back. I now recognize Ms. Jessica Vaughan for 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Since April is National Child Abuse Prevention Month, this is an appropriate time to draw attention to the horrific crime of human trafficking as a particularly insidious form of child abuse. My heart goes out to those survivors who are here today, and I salute them and admire the courage of their advocacy and thank them for being here. While obviously not all human trafficking is connected to illegal immigration, there can be no doubt that the current chaos at our border is actually facilitating human trafficking, both for commercial sex trafficking and also forced labor trafficking. The chaos is caused in part by the TVPRA, which the chairwoman mentioned, but also from the Biden administration's ill-advised dismantling of border and immigration enforcement, catch and release policies, the dysfunctional system for handling families and unaccompanied minors, and lax oversight of temporary visa programs. Just yesterday, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas released the new plan to deal with the escalation of the crisis that is forecast to occur in the next month, due in part to ceasing use of Title 42 expulsion authority. Anyone concerned about human trafficking should be further alarmed, because this plan makes it clear that the Biden administration intends to remain a full-fledged partner in migration-related human trafficking schemes. The overarching goal of the Mayorkas plan is to more efficiently manage, really accommodate, the enormous and growing flow of illegal border crossers into the United States and its communities. Mayorkas has set up tent cities with the capacity to process 18,000 illegal border crossers a day. He's hired more staff, secured more buses, and readied $150 million in new funding to pay NGO contractors to support and transport the migrants. The emphasis is on swifter processing, to the point where they'll actually be doing it on CBP buses as the migrants are transported. This is not a recipe for effective screening, vetting, or detecting human trafficking. Apparently, all migrants will have the opportunity to either make a quick asylum claim or enter the country with a notice to appear an immigration point at some point far in the future. Either way, most will get to enter. Unaccompanied minors will be fed into the same dysfunctional system we have now, in which the trafficking of children for labor and commercial sex occurs right under the noses of the government agencies and contractors who process these kids. The Mayorkas plan barely even acknowledges that trafficking is a problem. The phrase human trafficking is only mentioned on page 17 of a 20-page document, along with other crimes. The plan maintains the exact same policies that the traffickers are able to exploit, that enable them to tempt and coerce migrants into their clutches, that enable them to rely on the U.S. government to assist in taking advantage of and abusing vulnerable migrants. The traffickers know the Border Patrol will be waving in illegal border crossers by the tens of thousands a day, and that they can move their bodies as part of the rest of that flow without attracting attention. They know that the shelters and service providers will be overwhelmed and overflowing with other vulnerable people who will be easy marks for the traffickers to help. They know, though many Americans may not, that minors will be released to sponsors with few questions asked, no background checks, no post-release monitoring. They know that there will be no worksite enforcement to bust illegal or exploitative employment or detect identity theft. They know that they can make a lot of money at the expense of the victims, and that the Biden administration is in denial about the scale of the problem, or that their policies are aiding the traffickers. What the Mayorkas plan lacks, but which Congress must do, is stop incentivizing illegal immigration. It's wrong to have policies that entice migrants to turn over thousands of dollars and themselves and their families to criminal organizations to bring them to cross the border illegally. The government must end its partnership with the traffickers. Fix the loopholes in the law that the traffickers exploit, especially focus on the rules that on unaccompanied minors, on the parole of asylum seekers, address the problem of labor traffickers masquerading as labor contractors who bring in temporary visa workers. And services for survivors are needed, but it's much better to prevent the trafficking from happening than to try to ameliorate the problems that result from it. Thank you very much.
Lady's time has expired. I now recognize Ms. McKenzie for 5 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and members of the committee, good morning. My name is Shamir McKenzie, and I'm here to talk to you about our shared connections as human beings and the horrific crime of human trafficking. I want to start off by asking you to think about what you imagine your life would be like when you were a child. As a child, I never imagined being forced into commercial sexual exploitation by a man who used physical and psychological violence to maintain control over me for his own profit. I never imagined being robbed of my freedom, first by my trafficker and then by the US criminal justice system. For victims of human trafficking, there are severe consequences for not carrying out your trafficker's demands, consequences I know all too well. When I refused my trafficker's orders to drive the other victims he controlled over state lines, he asked me to choose between death and his demands. When I refused him, my trafficker responded by placing a gun in my mouth and pulling the trigger. Shortly after escaping his brutality, I found myself victimized again, this time by the legal system that treated me not as a victim, but as a criminal. Knowing little about the epidemic of criminalization facing trafficking victims, or even my own rights as a victim of crime, I accepted a plea to conspiracy to commit violations of the Mann Act as a result of having driven my trafficker's other victims across state lines. In addition to leaving me with a criminal record for acts I was forced to commit, I had to register as a sex offender. I wish I had more time to tell you about the details of my story, but I want to tell you that my story is not unique. For the last 11 years, I have dedicated my life to this anti-trafficking movement. You heard in my introduction about the things that I do here in the United States, but I'm also appointed the first anti-trafficking ambassador to Jamaica and work on this issue there. I am also a member of the Just Exit Advisory Council, along with 7 other amazing survivor leaders who have lived experiences just like mine. I appear before you today to make clear that the criminalization of victims is the most pressing issue in our country's fight against human trafficking. A 2016 study conducted by the National Survivor Network offers us a glimpse of the depth and breadth in this injustice, with 91% of our survivor members reported having a criminal record. This study makes explicit the reality that human trafficking survivors are regularly criminalized, and they are also, as I was, forced to be complicit in their traffickers' operations. While we have over 43 states that have implemented some form of criminal relief, there is currently no relief on a federal level. As a result, victims of trafficking continue to be charged as perpetrators alongside their traffickers. Once they are, they remain burdened with an unjust criminal record for the rest of their lives. I have 6 concrete suggestions of how Congress should respond to the criminalization of victims. 1, support and pass a comprehensive federal criminal relief record that will allow survivors to vacate or set aside their trafficking-related criminal convictions. Pass Sarah's Law, named in honor of child trafficking survivor Sarah Cruzan, who killed her trafficker and was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 16. Sarah's Law would allow courts to have greater flexibility in creating a trauma-informed, age-appropriate response, including transferring a child victim from an adult criminal system to a juvenile system for treatment and services. And of course, we need to reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which include provisions that allow judges to deviate from mandatory minimums and suspend sentencing for child sex trafficking victims who commit crimes. We need to increase funding for development and delivery of trainings aimed at advanced human trafficking topics, especially topics as forced criminality beyond prostitution, trainings on forced complicity, both on labor and sex trafficking. The time to act is now. Criminalizing trafficking victims does not help victims. In fact, it does the exact opposite. My fellow Just Exhibit consultant, Joy Friedman, posed the question, when do victims of trafficking stop paying the price? The answer must be now. We need Congress to lead the way. Thank you for this opportunity to share my perspective before this committee.
Thank the witness for their testimony. Mr. Christian Eduardo, for 5 minutes, you are now recognized.
Good morning, Chairwoman Lee and members of the subcommittee. My name is Eduardo, and I am a survivor of international domestic sex and labor trafficking. I am a Latino immigrant, originally from Mexico, a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and a person living with HIV, and a human dealing with the consequences, lifelong consequences of human trafficking. Due to the barriers caused by the intersectionality of my identity, I was sexually and physically exploited when I was the most vulnerable. I am here today representing not only myself, but the thousands of voices that are often silenced. And these include survivors, people of color, immigrants, people living with HIV, people from the LGBTQ+ community, the voices of our communities, people exploited by pimps, brothel owners, and sex buyers that are roaming free without any accountability. To be very honest, I sit here doubting whether I should share my story or not, because the consequences of trafficking do not end when you are free of exploitation. Telling my story can negatively impact my personal, academic, and professional path. There is no legal protection from discrimination based on what I experienced, what I survived. What if a future employer discovered the meaning behind the blank space of my resume? What is going to happen if my family and friends learn today that I was constantly raped? What if my exploiters find out that I dared to tell the truth about my exploitation? What if the buyers, the sex buyers who were raping me every day, and all the others who access my body want to retaliate against me? Who is going to protect me? Who is protecting all the survivors who raise their voices against the system of exploitation? Human trafficking is real, and I'm here to remind you, I survived it and I experienced it on my own skin. Despite the Trafficking Victim Protection Act being reauthorized several times, human trafficking is still classified as a nonviolent crime in many states. Survivors continue to suffer from the trauma of exploitation until our last breath on this earth. Meanwhile, pimps, brothel owners, and especially sex buyers walk free as if the harm they caused can be erased. Survivors and victims around the country are constantly criminalized and incarcerated. This is happening due to the lack of understanding about trafficking and the lack of empathy towards those engaged in the sex trade, including prostitution. We are the ones oftentimes blamed from our own exploitation. We are the ones being sentenced to jail. We are the ones with criminal records for actions committed under conditions of coercion, fraud, debt bondage, or force from our traffickers, the brothel owners and sex buyers raping us day after day. If this is the best that we can do, we are failing. I was trafficked as an adult. Trafficking is not only happening to minors, but this criminalization of survivors and people impacted by trafficking also is impacting kids. Under federal law, child trafficking victims do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Yet, in several states, they are the ones being targeted by police as criminals. I was trafficked in the United States, the country where dreams come true. I was trafficked in this country regardless of the TVPA. Some of the barriers that prevented me from escaping my situation was the fear of the criminalization of those engaged in the sex trade. Policies that blame immigrants for their own exploitation. All these are forms of victim blaming that allow exploiters to keep victims and survivors under control. I was so afraid to ask for help, to call the police because of the potential consequences. My choices were being deported as an immigrant, spending my life in jail, or ongoing emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. The expansion of required training to better identify victims of human trafficking is necessary for every single provider who interacts with marginalized communities and people in vulnerable situations. When I first approached a shelter after escaping my trafficking situation, I was asked if I had ever engaged in sex for food, shelter, drugs, or money. My answer was yes, which was a strong indicator of trafficking. Yet, I was totally ignored. The service providers did not prove whether I was being criminally exploited. And this doesn't happen one time. This happened when I was looking for resources, legal, immigration, or even a safest place to stay. This is the reality. We are failing. We are not training enough, and we are not recognizing victims. The system is particularly weak in the identification of male victims. I wasn't able to find services for males. I was denied services just because I am a male. I didn't qualify for a lot of services because I don't identify as a female.
Mr. Eduardo, can you, we want to hear you. Can you wrap up and summarize for us?
Yes.
Please? We want to hear your voice. We
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
If we really want to stop trafficking, we must stop the demand for the bodies, the normalization of rape, and acknowledge that sex buyers are violent and harmful. While I was being exploited, in one occasion, I was bleeding from my anus, and I didn't know what to do because I was afraid that service providers, law enforcement, were sex buyers. There is no deterrent, there is no federal protections to stop people in position with power, even our politicians, judges, or law enforcement, to not being sex buyers. And this is stopping us from looking for help. To summarize my call of action, I recommend expanding training around identifying victims and survivors from marginalized communities, expanding services for adult and male survivors, ending the criminalization of victims and survivors, including those engaged in prostitution, and holding sex buyers accountable. This approach is known also as the equality model. So please listen to survivors. You have the power to change, and you have the power to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Sheriff Mark Daniels for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair,
And
Ranking Member Biggs.
And I assume, Sheriff, that you adhered to the oath that was taken. You
Yes,
did,
ma'am.
Thank you so very much. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Biggs, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee regarding the status of our southern border from the aspect of a community, law enforcement perspective, for the good of all our victims that have been trafficked and smuggled. I have served our southern border communities for 38 years, and prior to that, a member of the military, serving in the U.S. Army station here at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, located in Cochise County. I've always been a general believer in my oath of office to protect our country, and now my county as the duly elected sheriff for the past 9 years. I'm the current president of the Arizona Sheriff Association, chair of the National Sheriff Association Board of Security, and on the executive board for Western Sheriffs and Southwest Border Sheriffs. We share 4 objectives: public safety, national security, humanitarian, and health due to the current pandemic. American sheriffs stand united in working with you. I am proud of our relationships with all our law enforcement partners that serve our communities. To begin, I want to thank the Customs and Border Patrol officers and agents that work tirelessly to protect this great nation. I want to thank our governor, Doug Ducey, and our state congressional members for all their support. The men and women of my office for their dedication and commitment to keeping our community safe, and to all my fellow sheriffs who stand united for the rule of law and the good of our American people. The direct impact of my office: secondary checkpoints have been shut down over last 15 months due to staffing issues. Border Patrol working with my county, working on a skeleton crew due to agents being deployed out of my county and out of my state. My citizens and law enforcement address mostly gotaways in my county versus those giving up. Between 900 to 1,000 smugglers and traffickers enter my county to pick up the migrants and the victims. These smugglers include juvenile drivers being recruited via social media by the cartels. My border-related detention costs for state violations was $1.5 million absorbed by my taxpayers. That equals 777 arrests just in my county in the last 9 months. Border-related crimes are at an all-time high, from death, murder, aggravated assaults against my citizens, failed to yield, search and rescue and recoveries for the migrants that die in our deserts, and yes, assaults against law enforcement. A personal story: a citizen of my county driving to her 65th birthday party was struck by a 16-year-old driver, smuggler, who ran a red light at 100 miles an hour and killed her. My fellow sheriffs have tried to partner with this administration to include the President of the United States, and with high hopes to share a collective message, a collective action plan for all our citizens and those being victimized, to support the rule of law, prioritize our southern border, and provide updates reference community impacts and concerns with little or no success with these plans. By allowing our border security mission and immigration laws to be discretionary, these criminal cartels, transnational organizations continue to be the true winners Their exploitation of mankind is simply modern-day slavery, allowing thousands of pounds of illicit drugs into our country that continue to erode the core value of families, schools, subsequently killing Americans on an average of 270 every day. It's completely unacceptable at any level. Experiencing migrant deaths without a reasonable process while U.S. Congress and the administration intentionally avoids reality is gross negligence. Our voice of reason has been buried during what I call intellectual avoidance here on the southern border by this administration and, yes, certain members of U.S. Congress. Communities have been neglected and abandoned, relying on our own local and state resources to address border crimes and trafficking. Our southern border against all public comfort statements out of Washington, D.C. is the worst shape I've ever seen it. When one looks at public safety, national security, humanitarian, our southern border is the largest crime scene in this country. The morale of agents is extremely low, and the collective frustration is very high amongst law enforcement at all levels, to include our citizens that live in the border communities. With the recent news to cancel Title 42, this only serves to complex a border that needs immediate immigration reform by U.S. Congress, but most important, needs to be secured. I'm a true believer that Customs and Border Patrol are the experts of border security, while sheriffs and police chiefs are experts of community. Together, this is a recipe of success for all communities. I will leave with a final statement. We all serve priorities of Americans based on our shared oath of office to keep them safe, enhance their quality of life, and support the rule of law, absent political affiliation or the concern of re-election. Once again, I thank this committee for the invite and the opportunity, and now I stand ready to answer questions by members. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Sheriff. Now, Mr. Terry Fitzpatrick is recognized for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, members of the committee, for your leadership in combating one of the greatest human rights challenges of our time, and for this opportunity to recommend ways the U.S. can fill gaps in that effort. The Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, ATTEST, is a U.S.-based coalition that advocates for solutions to prevent forced labor and sex trafficking, to hold perpetrators accountable, to ensure justice for victims, and to empower survivors with tools for recovery. Our alliance includes shelter and service providers in more than 30 U.S. cities and organizations that work in over 100 countries. We advocate for a whole-of-government approach and bipartisan solutions. Human trafficking and forced labor are not only crimes, they are violations of human rights, civil rights, child rights, women's rights, worker rights, and migrant rights. Trafficking is an unfair trade practice, a tool of repression. It is often a result of racial, ethnic, class, and religious discrimination, and it undermines economic development. Addressing these root causes helps reduce vulnerabilities that makes people easy targets for traffickers. Now, as some have mentioned earlier, there are 2 major things to address in the 117th Congress. One is the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. You may know that 3 bills have been introduced so far covering different aspects of reauthorization, and a 4th is coming soon, possibly this week. The TVPA is one of the world's most ambitious and comprehensive pieces of anti-trafficking legislation. ATTEST supports the reauthorization bills, and we urge you to enact them. In my written testimony, you'll find a bullet list of many of the new provisions that add new policy provisions and authorizations for federal programs within the TVPA. The second major issue this Congress is appropriations. Fighting a problem as large as human trafficking requires significant investment. Our FY23 appropriations recommendations total $1.3 billion, and we urge you to support robust funding. This is throughout the federal government. The U.S. has built one of the strongest anti-trafficking responses in the world, but we don't always live up to our ideals or our own standards. And I have 6 specific recommendations today for you to address, to think about shortcomings in America's response. 1, a prevalence study. You can't cure it if you can't count it. Congress needs to know the scale and dynamics of the problem in order to prioritize resources. The Justice Department has been mandated with developing prevalence methodologies, but it has not yet been done. Victim protocol is recommendation 2. This is working upstream of federal vacature laws. Law enforcement agents often arrest trafficking victims in part because they don't recognize them as victims. As well, agencies don't often have referral systems in place for shelters or trauma counseling or experts on survivor rights. The Departments of Justice and Homeland Security have been mandated with developing a victim protocol, but it has not been done. Recommendation 3, the criminal records, as many have stated before me, I think the count might be 46 states now have the ability for trafficking victims to help clear their records. It's time for Congress to catch up and pass a federal vacature law. Recommendation 4, transparency in the prohibition of forced labor in government contracts. You may know that U.S. procurement rules prohibit tax dollars from being used for products made by forced labor. However, oversight should be strengthened to include trafficking compliance officers at all federal agencies, publication of reports on the number of investigations, the number of contracts terminated, and other steps to ensure compliance. Congress must ensure that violations are referred to the Justice Department for action. Recommendation 5, foreign labor recruiters. International labor recruitment is a loosely regulated field, which allows traffickers to trick migrants by posing as legitimate labor recruiters. Even legitimate recruiters charge exorbitant fees and usurious interests, trapping migrants in debt bondage. We urge Congress to strengthen these regulations. Lastly, recommendation 6, equity gaps. Federal funding increases over the past decade have been directed largely towards sex trafficking, leaving labor trafficking, and those programs are now under-resourced. As well, there's an emphasis on prosecutions, which has left gaps in prevention and protection programs. There's a need to increase attention on labor trafficking and to rebalance the 3 Ps of prevention, prosecution, and protection. Again, my thanks for your time, and the Attest Coalition stands ready to answer any questions at any time, now or in the future, from any of your offices. Thanks.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. I'm now pleased to recognize for 5 minutes Ms. Jacqueline Alibutto. You're recognized.
Thank you to the members of the subcommittee, Chairwoman, and Honorable Sheila Jackson-Lee. I am honored to be here to testify about the oversight of federal efforts to combat human trafficking. My name is Jacqueline Alibutto. I serve as the Community Awareness Coordinator for the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance of the Southern District. It is the 4th largest task force in the nation created by the Justice Department. I'm also here representing No Trafficking Zone. I'm the president of this organization. In our organization, we study trafficking trends. Amongst those trafficking trends, we study life patterns and predatory behaviors, which helps us to provide information to dismantle and disrupt this intricate crime. Among the other things that we do, we advocate for victims. I wanted to walk you through what victims are going through in high schools across America. Recently, SB 1831, No Trafficking School Laws, passed to protect children in schools, making it the first-degree felony for recruiting and trafficking of a child while at school or during a school-related event. Over 55% of victims were contacted when they were in school in the state of Texas, which is an alarming number. That is more than half. I now want to walk you through what these victims are going through and what it is really like to be a child victim in the United States of America. It is not just the atrocities that predators and organized crime are committing against them. It is also that our justice system refuses to recognize exactly what this crime is. We're not educated enough to identify this crime, nor do we understand the trauma that these victims will face. I met Courtney Litvak 2 years ago. When I first met her, she was crying on a floor, very upset, and didn't think that her life was worth anything. If you know Courtney Litvak, you know that she serves on the White House panel. She does so many things for her community, and she's probably the most beautiful person I've ever met in my life. She will help anyone. During Courtney's story, when she was trafficked, not only did her school label her as a bad girl, derogatory behaviors, they also bullied her parents and her to stop fighting for their children's rights. And I want to explain this to you. This is a normal occurrence every day across America. If you are a victim in school and you talk about trafficking, it becomes very uncomfortable for the schools because we become more worried about being the liability of the school versus the accountability. And the reason why is because when traffickers send in the recruiters are children themselves who are grooming the kids. When they introduce the children to drugs, they then take them to strip clubs. After they are learned to dance, they are forced to have sex. Among those, the girls will let you know and tell you that they were beaten in. And so what does breaking in mean? Breaking in means if I do not conform to what you're telling me to do, I will beat you, I will rape you, then I will have you gang raped and beat you again, and then videotape it. And after I videotape it, I'm going to distribute it across all social media platforms. And after I distribute it off of all social media platforms, those victims and their parents have to watch their children be raped over and over and over again, as our nation and our government says that it is okay. CSAM, also known as child sexual abuse material, it is illegal. We do have to fight for that. Imagine your child being raped and having to watch that over and over and over again as social media platforms are making billions of dollars. Child pornography in America makes over $20 billion a year. A majority of those IP addresses comes from this nation. We have a serious crime. Our nation is really failing our children. I come here to ask you to please listen to me. I do this every single day. I've done this for 2 decades. And I'm tired of seeing victims and their parents suffer. I'm tired of seeing our system not understand it. We do need training, but we need specific training. We need scenario-based training. We do need funding, but we need reallocating of funding. Because the foster care system, the more money it gets, the more we are still hurting children. And so I ask you to look at, please pass the Internet Act. Please pass no trafficking zones. Because the most thing that we have to do is we have to come together as a nation and understand the difference between good and evil so that we can fight for our children. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk. I'm very honored.
Thank you for your powerful testimony. I'm now delighted to yield 5 minutes to Ms. Martina Vandenberg. Ms. Vandenberg, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, Chairman Nadler, and Ranking Member Biggs and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to appear before you today. The Human Trafficking Legal Center provides pro bono legal representation to survivors of human trafficking. Over the years we have done this work, we have recognized that survivors need legal counsel to navigate and fight for justice. As we survey federal human trafficking efforts, I'm reminded of the motto, deeds, not words. So let's start with criminal prosecution. At the Human Trafficking Legal Center, the vast majority of cases that we see are cases of forced labor. But victims of forced labor almost never see their day in court. In 2020, the last year for which we have official data, the Department of Justice brought just 15 forced labor cases in the entire country. In 2019, that number was 12. Prosecutions of forced labor are barely in the double digits. The Department of Justice has never prosecuted a perpetrator for forced labor under the extraterritorial jurisdiction provisions of the law, 18 U.S.C. 1596. And in cases that are prosecuted, restitution, a form of compensation to victims, is mandatory. But our own research has recognized and revealed that just 27% of cases that end in a conviction actually result in mandatory restitution orders. And even more troubling than the failure to obtain restitution orders for victims in these cases is the U.S. government's failure to collect the money that is ordered. Let me give you an example. Jose Alfaro, a survivor of child sex trafficking and a member of our board of directors, also received a restitution order in a criminal case against his trafficker. The other 3 victims in that case did not receive orders. Federal prosecutors in the case, U.S. versus Gandy, forfeited more than $200,000 from the defendant, but that money went to the federal treasury and not to the victims. And only years later, when Jose had obtained pro bono counsel, did the federal treasury finally disgorge the funds to cover restitution and remission. Years later. For survivors, the failure to receive restitution can be devastating. But even more devastating than that is when victims themselves are prosecuted and convicted for crimes related to trafficking. We are currently working on a federal criminal case in which a victim of forced labor has been charged with federal crimes, including fraud, and the prosecutors simply refuse to acknowledge her status as a victim in the case. And why does this matter? I think you have heard powerfully from the survivors on this panel why this matters. Trafficking victims prosecuted by federal authorities face lifelong consequences of conviction. They are barred from employment, ineligible for professional licenses, unable to rent apartments, and even unable to chaperone their own children's field trips at school. The list goes on, and this is why a federal vacatur statute is needed. Survivors must have the ability to vacate these convictions, and they must have access to an affirmative defense to avoid these convictions and prosecutions in the first place. I'd like to turn for a moment to what I call the forgotten P, which is prevention. For the last 2 decades, the U.S. anti-trafficking policy has prioritized prosecution, and this must now change, and the focus must switch to preventing these abuses. So what would prevent human trafficking? It's not what you think. One item is housing. It is one of the biggest gaps in human trafficking policy in the United States. What else would protect and prevent human trafficking? Protections for immigrant workers in the United States. Advocates have long called for greater protections for workers on A3, G5, and H-2A visas. Traffickers abuse these programs to make enormous profits at the expense of migrant workers. What else would prevent human trafficking? Enforcement of U.S. labor laws, including prohibitions on wage theft and child labor. In other words, fund the Department of Labor. You've heard today about survivor leadership. I want to quote Bukola Oriola, a survivor of forced labor from Nigeria, who said to me recently, "For me, survivor empowerment is key to stopping trafficking. We can only successfully stop it when we involve those who are directly affected." I agree completely and hope that you will continue to listen to survivors. I want to add one last point about forced labor, not just in the United States, but around the globe. We applaud U.S. and Customs Border Protection's ramped up enforcement of the import ban on goods made with forced labor under Section 307 of the Tariff Act. CBP is enforcing the law, and Congress should fund CBP adequately to carry out its forced labor mandate. With implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act set to commence in June 2022, we want to make sure that there are sufficient resources. I've included multiple recommendations in my written testimony, but I'll just close with this. We need deeds and not words. With deeds, we can eradicate human trafficking and forced labor. Thank you for this opportunity to testify at the hearing.
Thank you for your testimony, and thank all the witnesses for their testimony. It has been instructive, provocative, and insightful, and it is going to incite in the right direction because it is 2022, and as we sit here today, people are being violated and trafficked. So it is now time for questioning, and I would like to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Our time is very short, so I'll ask our witnesses to bear with me for short, pointed answers, and I'm going to start with Ms. Vandenberg. Thank you for highlighting the forced labor, as Ms. Chumbao has done as well. But let me quickly go to my opening statement. Human smuggling is horrible. The victim is the United States. The victim, certainly, people could come for many different reasons, but it is important to emphasize what human trafficking is and the depth of devastation and lack of protection for the victims of human trafficking. Can you give us that so that we're not confused between human smuggling and human trafficking?
Chairman Jackson-Lee, I'm so glad that you raised that issue in your opening statement, and I'm so glad that you've returned to it, because smuggling and trafficking are completely different phenomena. You don't even have to cross an international border to be trafficked, and the distinguishing feature for adults is that traffickers use force, fraud, or coercion in order to force someone to commit an act of labor or a commercial sex act. It is very, very important to distinguish between these two phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Ms. Chumbao, and I'm going to ask Mr. Eduardo as well. What are the barriers? We thank you for this pouring out your heart and your very personal story, which must be very painful. So what are the barriers that you found particularly challenging as a survivor, particularly Ms. Chumbao, of labor trafficking?
Thank you for that question. One of the barriers, again, is cultural understanding. It was, like I mentioned in my testimony, I was, age 9, and for me, coming to the United States was because of the television show that I saw on TV. So I thought America was just like, was just like that. I never knew that I was a victim of, modern-day slavery. And when I did get out to get help, and the investigator on my case, accusing me for wanting a green card, really, well, it was very hard for me to understand what a green card is, because coming from another country, we don't know that we need documents to work in this country. We don't know that you need green cards. So I was 9 years old. I just thought I was coming to go to school, and a lot of the barriers is just having understanding of where we come from and not being able to understand the laws and the rules of this country and what we need.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Eduardo, barriers concisely of what you face or what you think have been overlooked.
First is was that I am a male. There are no really services for male survivors, and there is this idea that only child and woman are being trafficked. Most of the services receive funding for women. I understand that the majority of people identified are women, but we are missing a lot of survivors because they are male. And the other important piece is that because I am an immigrant, we hear a lot of times this idea that immigrants, we are here to steal jobs, that we are all rapists, that we are belong to gangs. That was one of the main barriers that stopped me, like to even contact law enforcement or reach out for help, because I knew that, and it was one of the tools that my traffickers use. They say, that outside no one is going to support you, no one is going to believe you, and it was because I was an immigrant Latino from Mexico.
Thank you. As my time is moving, Mr. Fitzpatrick, we found out that in 2017, evidence that 53% of arrests for child prostitution were of Black children. The trauma and the stigmatizing occurs, particularly in diverse groups. Mr. Eduardo mentioned immigrants. Help us understand that and what should be done as it relates to trauma and sentencing of child survivors of trafficking.
Thank you for that question. I think there's a phrase that trafficking can happen to anyone, but I think it's important to note that it doesn't always, or most always, happen to people who are not people of color. And so some of the vulnerabilities that come with being of a person of color lead to vulnerabilities for traffickers. And these can be problems in the foster care system. These can be things that happen to all youths, unhoused youths and runaway and homeless youths. So you find them are particularly vulnerable to having to commit crimes of survival, including those that they are forced to commit by traffickers. These
I just have a few more seconds.
The trauma.
I need to move to another.
The trauma that this leaves behind on someone needs to be addressed at the point of intervention.
Thank you.
At the point of arrest or
Thank
rescue.
you. I asked Ms. Alibutto just very quickly, Ms. Alibutto, very quickly, how devastating it is to go to school and your parents think you're safe, and yet you're being trafficked at a school, maybe as young as elementary school.
It is extremely terrifying. It is terrifying to send your child to school where you think your child is safe, and then to understand that at an alarming rate across this nation, your child is at school being exploited. And many times the school is not marking the absences when they're aware of certain situations, but they are so afraid of how to handle it. And they are really more afraid of the liability versus accountability. I think it's terrifying for parents, but I also think it's terrifying for the children that they're not getting the help that they really need.
Thank you so very much. My time has expired. I recognize now Mr. Chabot for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who've testified here this morning. Human trafficking, there's no question, is a serious challenge facing us both here at home and abroad. In addition to being on this committee, the Judiciary Committee, I'm also the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And in that role, I've spent many years working on solutions to human trafficking all across the globe. Over the years, we've had some success in protecting young girls abroad by helping to improve their circumstances so that they become less vulnerable to human trafficking networks. I sponsored, for example, along with Senator Rubio some time back, bipartisan legislation which was signed into law by President Obama to make certain that every child, especially girls around the globe, are issued birth certificates. So many young girls in specific countries, their birth was never really marked by anything, and they sort of were lost and particularly subject to human trafficking. And so that has helped, but it's only one piece of the solution. Proper documentation for these children will not only improve their lives by making it easier to access schools and health services and other economic, legal, and political benefits in their home country, but also help combat the human trafficking, child marriage, and slave labor practices that flourish all across the globe. Here at home, there are additional steps that we can take to disrupt human trafficking networks. That starts with making sure that our southern border cannot be used by criminal trafficking networks to smuggle vulnerable children and women into the country. Unfortunately, in that effort, we've got a long way to go, because since he took office, President Biden has been busy reversing just about every one of the Trump administration's successful immigration policies. The Biden administration has stopped construction on the border wall, for example, ended catch and release, and has practically abandoned enforcement by ICE altogether, just to name a few of its misguided policies. Now the Biden administration wants to stop enforcement of Title 42, which currently allows ICE to quickly expel people trying to enter the United States illegally during a health emergency. The Biden White House has admitted that it has, quote, every expectation that there will be an influx of people to the border, unquote, when Title 42 is eliminated. That's going to make the problem even worse. Fortunately, a federal judge in Louisiana blocked the Biden administration from going forward with its plans to stop enforcement of Title 42, although I fear that this could be a temporary roadblock to the administration's plan. Simply put, the situation at the border is an unmitigated disaster, and it's about to get a whole lot worse potentially. And unfortunately, the massive influx of illegal border crossings that we're experiencing now will only make it easier for human trafficking networks to flourish by exploiting our lax border security. Ms. Vaughan and Sheriff Daniels, let me just ask you both a question. Do you agree that the chaos at our southern border created by the failed policies of the current administration have made it easier for human trafficking networks to smuggle vulnerable women and children into our country? Ms. Vaughan first, and then we'll go to the sheriff, if that's okay. If you turn your mic on. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes, I agree, because you can track this in the numbers, but it has overwhelmed of the Border Patrol and other agencies trying to grapple with this problem to the point where they are not able to easily detect trafficking that occurs right under their noses, because they are dealing with huge numbers of families and kids who are coming unaccompanied, and it is just making it impossible for them.
Thank you. Sheriff Daniels?
Sir, and I echo what Ms. Vaughan just stated, and also the fact that is with the surge coming across our border, the disarray, the lack of rule of law, and the messaging that from this administration, it creates a horrible situation for trafficking, and the fact that I'm talking about the victims that are being smuggled and trafficked into our country, that yeah, you're diluting our resources for enforcement in that rule of law. So yeah, it's a sad situation going on down here. It's an opportunity for those transnational organizations to exploit it, and that's happening every day.
And then finally, Sheriff, I don't have a whole lot of time left. I know that you communicate with a lot of your colleagues, other sheriffs and people in law enforcement. Do your views here, are they reflected by those others? And if so, if you wanted to comment on that.
I will say this, they do when it comes to what's going on. We stand for people, we stand for those who have been victims of crimes as sheriffs. But I will say this, one thing that is upsetting to me as a sheriff, and I speak to half my 3,000 sheriffs, is we need
You can
collective
answer
effort.
quickly, Sheriff. Their time has expired. Summarize.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We need a collective efforts of local, state, and federal working together. That's how we're going to solve this problem.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Chairman's time, the member's time has expired. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Chumbao, would it have helped you to have an attorney assigned to you while the criminal case against your trafficker went on?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Would it have helped you to have an attorney assigned to you while the criminal case against your trafficker was going on?
Yeah, it would have helped. It did help, so there was one attorney, that was very helpful, especially she was helping me to teach me about my rights. It definitely did help to have an attorney while my case was being investigated, and also teaching me what I need to know and what the process was. So having an attorney assigned to my case definitely did help, and it definitely can help with other cases.
Thank you. Ms. McKenzie, you pled guilty to trafficking crimes based on actions your trafficker forced you to take. How often are victims of human trafficking forced to commit crimes by their traffickers?
Traffickers create their criminal enterprise to evade criminal charges. So this is a common practice amongst traffickers. They know the laws better than the victims know the laws. They know the laws better than some of us in this room. Yeah. And so they create their enterprise to ensure. I mean, there's even a book that this trafficker wrote that says, keep your hands clean. You have to be seen. You have to use others as cat paws. So they're teaching even other traffickers.
A trafficker wrote a book on how to be a trafficker?
Yes, there are tons of books out by traffickers teaching others how to be a trafficker.
Wow. Mr. Eduardo, can you expand on the obstacles you face as an LGBTQ plus survivor, and how can we better support the needs of LGBTQ plus trafficking survivors?
Yes, actually, I think that we have great examples in the South about bills that are stopping education around LGBTQ plus individuals. And this just fuels homophobia and transphobia. Even I'm living in New York City, and I have faced homophobia not only here, also in Mexico, and that was one of the main barriers for me, because I knew that I wasn't going to be accepted and that there is still homophobia in this country. That's a big, big barrier because of the fear of just being denied services for who you are, or not being seen as a full human being because I am identified as a gay male. So that needs to change, and if we want to fight against trafficking, we cannot support bills that are stopping rights for LGBTQ plus community. And I need that we need to stop silencing, and we need to educate ourselves more. It's not about making more gay people or transgender individuals, but it's about recognizing the barriers that we face, that there are no services for us and we are denied based on our sexuality or even sometimes our appearance.
And how can the government better support the needs of LGBTQ trafficking survivors?
Recognizing our rights, recognizing and creating federal efforts to address discrimination or any other form of stigma. And I think that a lot of times, even politicians, they need to be aware of the language that is used, and that we are human beings. We are not rapists. We are not, as I experienced it, like, being part of the LGBTQ plus communities put me in high risk because of this discrimination and homophobia and transphobia that it's a lot of times part of the narrative that drives a lot of legislations.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick, why is a whole-of-government approach necessary to address human trafficking?
Well, in part because you need to work on prevention strategies, and some of those things are best done by Health and Human Services, or even you need to integrate anti-trafficking strategies into international development programs, and that needs to be done through state and USAID. The U.S. has global leadership in this area through the JTIP office in the State Department. So there's an avenue for State Department. We need to prosecute, of course. I'm not against prosecuting. I just wish we'd see more prosecutions of labor trafficking. And that means we need to involve the Labor Department and not just the Justice Department. So that's why I think of this as a whole of government. Education programs as well. Inside the TVPRA, there's a new trafficking provision for the Transportation Department. So I think it's great that we have this diverse set of actions happening throughout the federal infrastructure to work on different parts of the problem.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Judge Gohmert for 5 years, not years, but 5
You stand for this prayer, I can tell you that.
I don't know if that meant incarceration or time, but in any event, 5 minutes, Judge, you're now recognized.
And I appreciate the chair, thank you. And I appreciate y'all being here. And my heart goes out to those who have been victimized by human trafficking. It's just horrendous. And I know my friends across the aisle are not big supporters of mandatory minimums, but for children's sake, it seems like that ought to be a place. Human trafficking, what's been done to children, ought to bring about some commonality between people on both sides of the aisle. That 6.5 years has already been pointed out by some. That is not enough for someone who is engaging in trafficking, sex trafficking, human trafficking for minor children, for heaven's sake. They need to be doing some long, hard time. That is one thing that, and I appreciate that being brought up by some of the testimony. And Mr. Eduardo, what you've been through is just unconscionable. Anybody would do the things that have been done to you. There ought to be a mandatory minimum where they're locked up for many years as a general deterrence and specific deterrence. But you indicate that you feel like your biggest problem is discrimination and homophobia. It sounds like the hell you've been through has a lot more to do with the trafficking than been done than any type of homophobia. I know your testimony, you're a Latino immigrant. Did someone sell you to somebody in this country from another country? How did it come about that you were trafficked?
No, actually, I experienced twice trafficking from Mexico to Canada. That's the international.
Does that mean somebody
sold me to another person?
Yeah, so where was the person that sold you to Canada?
The person who first started trafficking, my first trafficker, it was in Mexico. He had connections with someone in Canada, and everything started as a...
Was this somebody in your family, like this Chumbao? Didn't you say it was your uncle?
Yes.
Yeah, was it a relative who sold you?
No, actually it was part of it was another gay male, and that's why I think that a lot of times we don't understand the narrative.
So he was gay, but he had
Yes.
homophobia, and that's how your problem started?
No, the problem is that society isolate us because we are gay. We are denied jobs. We are denied from opportunities.
So somebody in Canada actually paid for you, and you came to Canada. Did the person in Canada sell you to the United States?
No, actually I escaped because, as I said, it's when I had this situation when I was bleeding, and I just escaped. And the thing was that I didn't want to go back to Mexico, so I traveled here to the United States.
Yeah.
And
Because it seems like we do need to focus on exactly how this gets started. And Ms. Jomo, it sounds like, I know you said that, you know, racism was at the base of it, but was your uncle white?
No.
Because it sounds like greed is a bigger problem, that we're allowing people who are greedy to just totally disregard the rights of someone like you and send you into a life of a childhood of hell, what you've been through. And so I'd really want to bear down on exactly how that came about, like Mr. Eduardo was telling us. How did that actually come about, that your uncle would say? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So for my case, again, my trafficker was also a Cameroonian, but a U.S. citizen that is based in the U.S. My trafficker has their family owns like big businesses in Cameroon, you know, and my uncle worked for a lot of wealthy people in Cameroon as a driver. So I guess this woman just came and stated that she was looking for someone. And my uncle thought I would be the right person to come to America. And when it comes to race, the reason why I mentioned racism being part of the problem, again, because a lot of the time, us as people of color, you know, I traffic a lot, and we don't get to, you know, see ourselves, you know, in the media talking about this issue of trafficking. And so the reason why I say race, because if you Google human trafficking and you click on images, you get to see that they don't really show people of color. You know, so that's why I talk about race, and it's really hard for us people of color to get services.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I appreciate it, Madam Chair, but we really do need to work together to make it as difficult as possible for people to be sold into this country. It's just terrible what's going on. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Atlanta, Georgia, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses, and specifically to our witnesses before us today who are survivors of trafficking. I've read your testimonies, and from the bottom of my heart, I really, really want to thank you for being with us today. And I know that it's not easy to be here sharing your stories, but I do really admire your strength and your determination. And thank you once again for being here today. And, you know, the horror of human trafficking, whether that be sexual trafficking or labor trafficking, is a national plight. And it's affecting each of our districts. All of us are members of Congress. And sadly, human trafficking can happen to anyone, no matter their background. But victims of human trafficking disproportionately tend to be Black, Latino, and Indigenous women and girls. However, we know that there's also a significant problem of human trafficking victims who are male, as has been expressed this morning, and sadly are often overlooked and undercounted in these kinds of tragedies. It's imperative that we do everything in our power to combat human trafficking. And in addition to increasing prosecution of human traffickers, we must prevent it before it happens. We've got to be better at being proactive. That means protecting vulnerable communities, such as children in the welfare system, youth who have encountered the juvenile justice system, runaway and homeless youth, and intervening before they're faced with exploitative recruitment practices. And we must be, it's just essential that we make sure that we're doing everything that we can through a holistic approach to solving human trafficking. My first question is for Ms. Chumbao. You know, when we think about identifying victims of human trafficking, we often do not think of our healthcare providers. And however, studies have found that between 68% and 88% of human trafficking survivors in the United States alone encounter a healthcare provider during their trafficking, but are not recognized as trafficking victims. Did you ever encounter a healthcare provider while you were a victim of forced labor? And did that person recognize that you were a trafficking victim? And in what ways can we ensure that healthcare providers are properly trained to be able to screen for victims that have been trafficked?
Thank you for your question. And yes, to your answer, I did encounter a healthcare person when I was in my trafficking situation. I'll give an example. My trafficker, again, I had mentioned my trafficker was very abusive towards me. And one time I didn't do something right in the kitchen. I wasn't able to cook the food properly for the kids. And so my trafficker used a metal broom to beat me, and my knee broke and, you know, it cracked open, and I have the scar here to show that. So she took me to the emergency room, and she was there with me. And when I remember the nurses and the doctor came in and asking what happened, and I couldn't really say much because my trafficker was there. And it was really hard for me to tell, this doctor and nurses what happened, so I just said, hey, I fell down. It would have been nice if the nurses, a doctor at that time would have asked my trafficker to go out. Maybe I would have said exactly what happened, or maybe if they just noticed the way I didn't look so happy, I looked, unnourished, because I really didn't eat a lot, during my trafficking situation. And they didn't ask the right question, and they didn't do the right, proper way to say, hey, get out there, let me talk to this young lady. And my trafficker being there really made it hard for me to be able to communicate of what happened. So nurses and doctors, they're doing really well now to try to get training about this issue. And I would say that it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to nurses and doctors of how they can be able to identify trafficking victims when they come to the emergency room or go to the doctor. But that was my first time ever going to the emergency room after being with my trafficker for such a long time.
Thank you so much for that. I really am grieved by, the things that you've been through. And Mr. Fitzpatrick, we know that many trafficked youth experience a significant amount of trauma prior to their exploitation, making them more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. What can we do better to support victims and intervene in the cycle of abuse of vulnerable children that are often victim to this kind of trafficking?
Well, I think the McKinney-Vento Runaway and Homeless Youth Act has programs that help with children's vulnerabilities, and funding those programs, I think, is really important. Our alliance supports that, and the National Network for Youth is in our coalition. As well, I think educating doctors to intervene. One of our organizations in our coalition is Heal Trafficking, doctors to train other doctors on what to look for. So just like doctors are trained to look for child abuse or neglect or domestic violence if someone shows up in their ER. One recent example is they handed out 20,000 brochures on human trafficking in India, in a trafficking hotspot, when people were getting their COVID vaccinations. Integrating anti-trafficking interventions into medical settings is another way. The same thing, we've called for a comprehensive study on the connection between gender-based violence and human trafficking. And we hope that might get introduced as part of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So there's several things we can do on several fronts to help cope with trauma and root causes that may leave people
The
vulnerable.
gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, my time has expired.
I now recognize Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Chumbao, did I hear correctly, traffickers were using the same passport as much as 5 times?
Yes, my trafficker used one passport, to bring 5 of us into the United States. Again, I didn't know that I came into the country illegally. So I didn't know that, I didn't know any of that. So, but yes.
Thank you. Ms. Alibutto, did I hear you say that grooming is happening in schools
Yes, sir.
frequently?
Yes. Grooming is happening. It's systematic grooming. It's happening in schools. It's happening on social media. And if you want me to walk through how simple and easy it is to groom someone, you study their vulnerabilities. You understand that a lot of youth do not understand the boundaries, and you start testing them and pushing them. And once you start testing them and pushing them, the job is to strip them of their identity so much that they become what you want them to become.
Should we regulate social media in regards to this?
I think absolutely, if you're going to put allow CSAM, child sexual abuse material on, because it is against the law to create it and distribute it, yes, I do.
And is it on social media currently?
Yes,
And you could find it for me readily?
I probably could, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Vandenberg, you talked about prevention, and I think you mentioned the Uyghurs of Western China. Should we deny products that are made with slave labor for entry into our country?
Absolutely. And we are delighted to see the passage almost unanimously in the House and the Senate of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It goes into effect June 21st of this year. But the details are to be worked out. But absolutely those products made with Uyghur forced labor, whether it's in Xinjiang or whether it's Uyghur labor from the labor transfer program, it should be barred from entering the U.S., yes.
Have you had any American companies that have fought on that to not allow it to happen?
So, Congressman Tiffany, we just had public hearings on this on April the 8th, and a number of companies testified at that open hearing that was held by the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, which is tasked with enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and many of those companies asked for delay. They have been on notice for 2 years that Uyghur forced labor is not permissible. For 2 years, they have had time to plan, and yet they are asking for a phased implementation of the law that you passed. We think that's extremely troubling.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think companies, I'll name them like Nike and Apple and some of them, I think they need to shape up their practices in regards to this. And I'd also point out that many of the solar panels and wind turbines that come into this country are coming in via forced labor, being produced by forced labor in China. Sheriff Daniels, and by the way, just a gentle correction for the committee. It's not Daniels, it is Daniels. Sheriff Daniels, I visited you 2 years ago. Representative Biggs led a tour down there. It was eye-opening, first time for me going down to the Arizona border. And you said things were getting better, that progress was being made at that time. It was early June 2020. Is that still the case nearly 2 years later?
Good seeing you again, Congressman. And the answer to that is no. In fact, just the opposite. To give you an example, when you were here 2 years ago on our own virtual camera system, we saw illegal entries at a rate of about 400 a month. Now we're up to 8,000 a month. That's just off my Cochise County Sheriff's Office camera virtual system. 8,000 a month compared to 400. And then you multiply that throughout when it comes to the crime and all the different aspects of trafficking and smuggling. So yeah, we're in pretty bad shape here.
Did you say 400 versus 8,000?
Yeah, 2 years ago when you were here, sir, we had 400 a month.
So
now we're
20 times as many.
Yes.
20 times as many.
Yes.
How serious is it that we're beginning to hear this story about how American kids are now complicit in making this happen, and that they're being paid to bring in, especially young American kids that are, they're bringing in drugs and humans across the border. Have you seen that?
We're seeing a lot of that. Sadly to say, we're seeing kids being recruited through social media by the cartels. We're seeing it every day. I got a handful of kids in my jail right now, away from 14 to 17 years of age. And we're trying to get an injunction right now against social media to stop that recruitment against our social media sites. So the question you had earlier, I 100% echo, we need to have restrictions on our social media sites.
Ms. Vaughan, I'm sorry I can't ask any questions of you. I wish I could. My time is up. I yield back.
Time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to join us as we talk about the complexities of tackling the impact of human trafficking. I'd like to get back to the purpose of the hearing, exploring the ways in which our federal government can improve our response to trafficking, and in particular, how we can better protect survivors of trafficking. Before coming to Congress, I worked with agencies like the Human Trafficking Legal Center, Polaris, KIND, and supervised pro bono attorneys representing survivors of human trafficking on the range of issues they face. My team represented survivors lured by the promise of jobs and trafficked into forced labor, and survivors left vulnerable to trafficking after being let down by our child welfare system. Last Congress, Congresswoman Wagner and I led a bipartisan bill, the Protecting Access to Justice for Survivors Act, on this very topic. The legislation would improve access to legal representation for trafficking survivors through Department of Justice grants. and allow recipients to use funds for post-conviction relief proceedings, including vacatur, expungement, record sealing, or other post-conviction relief measures. And of course, an ongoing issue is to the extent that survivors of human trafficking are from other countries, their lack of status in our system and the inability of our legal aid system to provide representation creates more hurdles. So, Ms. Vandenberg, in your testimony, you talked about the importance of legal representation for survivors of trafficking. Can you speak more to the realities that survivors face in the legal system, whether that be cases that don't get prosecuted, unsatisfactory prosecutions, continued vulnerability to abuse due to immigration status, prosecution of survivors themselves, and the barriers that having a criminal record through no fault of their own can pose?
I would agree with absolutely everything that you just said. And thank you for your leadership in this area. When trafficking survivors do not have lawyers, they have tremendous difficulty asserting their rights. They have tremendous difficulty obtaining restitution. It is impossible to bring a civil case under 18 U.S.C. 1595 without legal counsel. We have enormous problems with trafficking survivors now getting immigration relief through the T-Visa program because this Vermont Service Center is moving so slowly that you can wait as long as almost 3 years to get a visa. It is almost impossible to navigate these complex systems without pro bono legal representation by your side.
Thank you. Any suggestions on how Congress can help ensure that representation is available? I mean, pro bono representation means that we have volunteer lawyers doing it, but perhaps there should be more, and I think that's what our bill was hoping to provide.
I completely agree. We are now able to find pro bono lawyers largely on the coast. It's very difficult to find pro bono lawyers in states that are not, California, New York, and perhaps Florida. But so it's very important that legal services receive funding and that organizations receive funding to provide those legal services through the nonprofit sector, because we cannot depend entirely on pro bono attorneys, particularly in places that are not sort of legal markets that are large.
Certainly, and many of the cases that the attorneys I worked with were representing folks. It was nurses or folks who were working at senior living centers in Arizona, for example, or someone who'd been lured to hotel service in Colorado. So it's certainly not a problem simply at the border or on the coast. Often we see that we get justice through lawsuits involving people's pocketbooks rather than necessarily the criminal justice system. So if restitution is mandatory, it seems like that could put a dent in some of these practices. How are traffickers avoiding paying restitution, and what could we do there?
One problem that I see is that there is infrequent forfeiture of defendants' assets, and even when those assets are forfeited, unfortunately, they're absorbed by the federal treasury rather than rerouted to trafficking survivors through restoration and payment of restitution. There has to be much, much more attention in the U.S. attorney's offices and in the financial litigation units in those offices to actually collecting the restitution that is owed. At this point, we are at a place where really victims with lawyers are almost always the only ones who actually see payment of restitution, and even then it's a fraction of the amount that's owed.
Well, it sounds like providing more counsel to folks who are in this situation would be helpful, and I see my time's expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
Chair Lay's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Fitzgerald for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we should retitle this hearing, Close the Border and Close It Now, because it seems the one thing that's in common with everything that's been discussed today is there is a steady stream of victims that have been created as a result of the border being wide open between Mexico and the U.S. Ms. Vaughan, I just wanted to ask, the other thing that seems common is there's this area of influence that one individual has over other individuals. It can be coercion, it can be addiction, it can take a lot of different forms. Can you talk about that and what's the dynamic that creates that, or how is that viewed, I guess, when you're talking about whether it's just trafficking somebody across the border and then, you know, them being sold to another trafficker, or, you know, we see prostitution rings around the U.S. that also are created under this idea that someone has control over another human being. I think that's something that's really hard for many Americans to kind of relate to. They don't get it. They hear human trafficking. They don't know what it really means or what it entails. So it's kind of brushed off as a topic that people are familiar with, but aren't necessarily in tune to what the dynamic is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. And that is a common thread that I have seen in a number of the cases that I've tracked over the years. And it starts with the ability of the traffickers to tempt people into this arrangement to have themselves brought to the United States illegally, but with a realistic expectation that they're going to be released into the country. But at that point, often the traffickers are able to keep them in their clutches by threatening them, or sometimes, you know, at first seeming to be benign, like telling them that they're going to find them a job. And this can be something that leads into the commercial sex trade, or in other cases, many cases, it turns out to be labor trafficking or a peonage or indentured servitude, like a case in Illinois where a woman, they paid, one of the victims, a father and his daughter, paid $14,000 to be brought to the border, knowing that they were going to be released, as happened. They gave the name of this woman, Concepcion Malinek, in Illinois, near Chicago, or in Chicago, who then charged them another $18,000 to be able to, supposedly for the transportation to her house. She got them jobs with fake IDs, working at a sandwich factory. She basically stole half of their earnings, telling them it was for bills that they owed her to repay their debts, threatened to turn them over to immigration. And, you know, this happened sort of with the blessing of our broken immigration system and catch and release policies, that this was able to happen. And there were dozens of others living in this horribly unsanitary house. In other cases, it's kids who come unaccompanied end up in government-run shelters or foster care placement situations. They're vulnerable. Sometimes they run away from those. We have seen, you know, and those are the most vulnerable, and those are the ones, for example, that some of the gangs, like MS-13, will draw into their clutches using the techniques that we've heard described here. So, and again, the system that we have that is being allowed to be perpetuated is set up to have swift release of kids from government custody, no follow-up, no home studies, no mechanisms. This is a disgrace. They would not pass muster in any state's foster care placement system. And yet, the priority, certainly for the current administration, is to allow people to get through the system as quickly as possible with as few questions asked as possible, and this is completely playing into the hands of the traffickers. This is what enables them to carry on this horrible brutalization of people and make money off of it, and the more money they make, the more they're going to keep doing it, the better able they are to control the situation in some of these other countries, bribe the officials that they need to bribe, and it just perpetuates the whole thing. But we are complicit in it as a government by having policies that allow people to be tempted in this way and allow the perpetrators to escape our attention, just pretending that this is some benign thing that's
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Excellent answer. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Liu for 5 minutes. Mr. Correa, are you present? Ms. Escobar. Mr. Cohen, Ms. Escobar?
Thank you. Oh, Madam Chair?
Yes, you are recognized, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for this hearing and for this opportunity. And I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I think it's really important, given the comments by some of our Republican colleagues, that I make something very clear from the onset. I am the only member of Congress on this committee who actually represents a border community. I am so proud to represent El Paso, Texas, and to give voice to the reality that we see on the ground on the border. The focus of this hearing should be what Congress can and should do, as well as what Congress has failed to do when it comes to human trafficking. It's clear that the policies championed by my Republican colleagues, policies like Remain in Mexico, policies like Title 42, policies created by Stephen Miller of the Trump administration, they have actually fueled human trafficking. It's also clear that by standing in the way of immigration reform, Republicans have done their best to close off legal pathways. In fact, we haven't reformed our outdated immigration laws in nearly 30 years. The last best chance we had at reforming outdated immigration laws was in 2013, and Republicans were the ones who obstructed. Congress had a bipartisan bill that was passed in the Senate, but House Tea Party members ensured that that bill never saw the light of day in the House of Representatives. Nevertheless, House Democrats have repeatedly worked to pass immigration reform, despite our Republican colleagues' best efforts to obstruct. And obviously, when you cut off legal pathways, when you create a system where there's no line to get into, there's no way to do it the right way because there's no way at all, obviously, immigrants and refugees will seek irregular pathways, making them vulnerable to human traffickers. So the best thing Congress can do today, right now, to help alleviate some of the horrors of human trafficking, it's pass immigration reform. And I invite my Republican colleagues to join us finally, once and for all. I do have a couple of questions for our panelists. For Martha Vandenberg, Ms. Vandenberg, in your testimony, you identified the work visa system and H-2A visas in particular as a major contributor to forced labor in the United States. Could you elaborate on the barriers that such visas present to visa holders who may need to leave an abusive employer?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. And I just want to mention an important indictment that just came down, U.S. versus Patricio. It is an indictment involving more than 20 defendants who are alleged to have brought and illegally petitioned, falsely petitioned for as many as 71,000 H-2A workers to come into the United States. The problem is that what we have in the United States is a system where your visa is tied to your employer. And so if your employer, the person who brought you into the United States, is abusive or harmful or trafficking you or holding you in forced labor, it is enormously difficult to leave. So I agree with you completely that we need to have immigration reform. And I agree also, though, that we need to have greater protections in the H-2A system so that people can actually leave abusive employers and fight for their rights and work legally in the United States as they have petitioned to do. These are workers who are here legally in the United States and they are facing forced labor.
Thank you, Ms. Vandenberg. I have one more question for you with my remaining time. Victims of trafficking who have arrest records may find themselves excluded from safe, affordable housing options, from educational opportunities and legitimate employment, which can leave them vulnerable to being re-trafficked. How do we effectively address the needs of trafficking survivors with arrest records to ensure they have access to housing?
I would just echo what Ms. McKenzie said, which is get rid of the convictions. At this point, we have vacatur and expungement statutes across the United States, and states have done a great deal, largely credit to the work of Kate Mogilescu and others, have done a great deal to end convictions of trafficking victims. But there's no federal equivalent, and so we very strongly feel that there should be a federal vacatur statute so that people do not face this kind of discrimination in housing and in other sectors.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone on here. I just would once again reiterate to my Republican colleagues, if you want to help stop human trafficking, work with Democrats to pass immigration reform. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Owens for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and witnesses for this opportunity to address this big issue. I guess I'll start off with our Democratic friends would love to have you not believe your lying eyes. It was the last year under Democratic control, the cartels are now making $500,000 per month trafficking. Last year under Democratic control, the cost of a child now to be trafficked is $5,000. It's under the Democratic control last year that we now have 40,000 unaccompanied kids have come past this border. Human trafficking is pure evil, period. And sadly, 200 years after my great-grandfather was trafficked here to this country, we still see it going on today. And I've always been told you can always judge someone's real intentions and priorities by how they use their time and their money. We have an administration who has failed to go to the border, like every one of my Republican friends have, to see this evil happening every single day. We now have NGOs that are completing the cycle of trafficking by taking these kids and women into the country, just dropping them off anywhere. We need to prioritize not only detecting, preventing human trafficking, and prosecuting these perpetrators, these predators, and giving survivors the resources and support they need to start anew. We also need to use some common sense. And what I see in my common sense of last year, it is this administration that's complicit with this process, that's partnered with the cartel because they want profit and power, and this is being done on purpose. You do not have this kind of misery by accident over this last 12 months, 18 months. In Utah, we're working on to lead our nation in these efforts with collaboration with our Attorney General, state, and local enforcement agencies. Utah's Transportation Authority announced last year that we'll begin to train staff to recognize human trafficking. Last year, I introduced a No Travel for Traffickers Act with my Democratic colleague, Republican Cohen, preventing trafficking kingpins from moving freely from country to country, ending the corrupt Golden Passport program. I've sponsored an Earn It Act, an End Child Exploitation Act, a Child Rescue Act, and other measures to strengthen federal efforts to prevent child exploitation. This issue of ending modern slavery has been a priority of mine from day one. If we're gonna ever get our country to where we want to truly live the American dream, this shows the stain on our heart. By just like in the 1800s, the government not being aware or closing their eyes to this evil going on because people making profits and profitability because of political profitability. So we need to make sure our children are not being abused and used and abused, and make sure we're identifying these government officials who simply do not care. Sheriff Daniels, shortly after, well, let me just say, do you have knowledge of what are the specific policies and programs at the border that could prevent child trafficking? Sheriff?
Well, thank you, sir, and I appreciate the question. The first thing, and this is what the national sheriffs have proposed, is a collective message, starting with the President of the United States, supported by Congress, our governors, our sheriffs, and our mayors, that we can all come together with a shared message, that we have a secure border, and we agree on immigration reform. Second to that is a collective action plan, and last but not least is the enforcement of the rule of law. If we can work together, it's amazing what we can get done. Right now, our border being in chaos the way it is a concealment for these transnational organizations to traffic children, adults, you name it. We have to work together. That's my biggest message to you all today. Thank you.
Jessica Vaughan, Ms. Vaughan, in your opinion, if the Biden administration does not address the issues at the southwest border, how will this impact our nation's security over the next year?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security is now predicting that the level of illegal border crossing probably is going to triple from several thousand a day, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 a day, to 18,000 a day, which means, and also we've now learned that the administration is planning on implementing changes to how migrants are processed to emphasize even faster processing and access to the United States rather than trying to put a stop to this flow by emphasizing sending people home. So, you know, there are a number of things that can be done. I mean, it's only going to get worse, and the systems are only going to be weakened. And we know, for example, today I read about an ICE case where a man connected to a terrorist organization who had crossed illegally near El Paso in September was just removed from the country. So clearly, bad actors, in addition to the traffickers and the gang members and so on, are trying to take advantage of our unsecure border.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentlemen, Mr. Steube is represented not for 5 years, but for 5 months.
Okay. I don't think I'd want to take 5 years, but
All right.
I'll take
5 minutes. The gentleman is recognized, not even for 5 months. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I just feel like I need to address the comments that were made by one of our Democratic colleagues about Republicans getting in the way of immigration reform. I think she fails to recognize the fact that the House is controlled by the Democrats, the Senate is controlled by the Democrats, and the White House is controlled by the Democrats. So if they wanted to pass immigration reform, they could have done it in the last year and a half, and that hasn't been able to be completed. So I would like to let somebody who knows what's going on the border, because Sheriff Mark Daniels is representative of a county that is as large as the state of Rhode Island and Connecticut combined. So regardless of whether the members of this committee sit on a border district, the good sheriff there knows exactly what's going on and has been there for over 30 years and has seen day to day what's happening with Biden's border crisis. Just recently, Sheriff, the DHS Secretary Mayorkas recently stated that the border crisis was a problem that he inherited from the previous administration. You have been sheriff there under both the Trump administration and the current administration. Could you highlight for the American people the vast differences in the effects of the policies that have been put in place between the two administrations?
Thank you, sir. It's a vast difference between President Trump, President Biden. This started under President Trump. We had manageable control on the border. Like I said, we had 400 a month. Now we're at 8,000 a month. Our gotaways are in my county, my section of state, are 16,000 gotaways. We lead the nation right now. We were the safest county on the southwest border out of 31 border counties. We had the greatest programs, the best collective efforts. It was working. Now we're one of the worst. I hate to say it like that, based on the fact that the numbers, the non-political numbers show that. And because the message, the rule of law, the consequences, this administration is not working with communities on the southwest border. That is the problem. And we're not addressing border security. There's a big difference.
Well, and talk about the gotaways for a second. I mean, we all see here in Washington, we see the numbers of the apprehensions, which were now over 2 million apprehensions just since Biden has taken office. But what they're not talking about is if we've apprehended over 2 million, I'm sure there's numbers, hundreds of thousands of more of people that, as you term them, gotaways, and the effect that that's having on the safety and security of the American people.
Well, since October 1st of 2021, we've had over 300,000 gotaways. These are people who can't give up. They're aggravated. They're serious criminals. They're your traffickers in so many ways that have come through into our country, and that's a nominal, minimal number on that. That should scare every American out there. Nobody's addressing border security. We got to address that. We need to address immigration reform, like we spoke by many of the people speaking today. But our border's in really bad shape right now. I mean, and that's saying it lightly. We have to actively engage in securing our border, addressing immigration reform, and start addressing collectively these issues down here. It's only going to get worse.
And these gotaways are typically your more hardened criminals that know how to get across the border to avoid Border Patrol because they either have a record or they've been previously deported. And so these are truly your high-end criminals that are intending on coming into our country to create harm and get experience in criminal activity. I mean, would you agree with that statement?
I would agree with that, sir. And that's why you don't see them in Del Rio and Yuma giving up, because they can't give up. These are very aggravated individuals, to include people from countries of interest. These are serious criminals that have no respect for America, no respect for Americans. And we have to address that. 2,000 a day are coming in our country right now. on Godaway status alone. So again, we got to do a better job. When the criminal cartels, the transnational organizations behind much of this trafficking and smuggling and drugs have more will than we do, they have come together united to do their illicit trade, we got to do better.
And we know of 43 terrorists, recognized terrorists that have gotten in, and that's not including the people we don't know in these gotaways. Real quickly, Mrs. Vaughan, in the time I have left that leads into this, in terms of allowing criminal elements into our country, what has been the worst or most harmful policies of the Biden administration?
Most definitely the catch and release that is happening at the border. Just the fact that they are really not attempting to turn back so many of the people who are making it here illegally and releasing them into the country without coordination with state and local officials.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I'm now pleased to recognize the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes. Ms. Bass, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing and your leadership on this issue. I wanted to direct my questions looking at trafficking, but looking at young people who are from the U.S., who are in the foster care system, the juvenile justice system, are from our inner cities that wind up being trafficked, especially sexual trafficking. I have a couple of pieces of legislation, one that calls on the Attorney General to provide training and technical assistance for government agencies, another to establish a working group to look at barriers that hamper data collection. And I wanted to know the witness's reaction to that. Bill I'm doing with Representative Smith is the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and we're talking about grants to assist people in recognizing trafficking. And I'm just wondering, for those of you that have been involved, I would direct this to Ms. McKenzie, Ms. Vandenberg, or Mr. Fitzpatrick, if you could talk about what we have been accomplishing in terms of trafficking, but of U.S. girls. My understanding is that the average age for a girl that is sex trafficked is 12 years old, and they tend to be girls from the foster care system or the juvenile justice system. So can Ms. McKenzie, Vandenberg, or Fitzpatrick comment on that?
Thank you, Representative Bass, for that question. I've been nominated to go first. Sadly, in our own research, looking, for example, at criminal restitution, what we found is that the least likely people to get criminal restitution in the United States are child victims of sex trafficking. And as you know, most of those children are U.S. citizens. The problem I see is that they don't have lawyers. And so if we were to improve one aspect of U.S. systems, it would be to provide attorneys for trafficking survivors, including U.S. citizen children.
Thank you very much. Ms. McKenzie, Fitzpatrick, would you like to comment on that?
I thank you for your question, and I definitely believe the legislation that you have introduced will continue to help address this issue of trafficking. This issue of trafficking, it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. We're talking about people's lives here, right? We're talking about human beings who are being bought and sold here on our own U.S. soil. And we need to come together and put this politics aside. We need to come together and really address it. And what you're doing to implement training on a federal level so that we can get these traffickers and hold the true perpetrator, who is the trafficker and not the victim, accountable. So I thank you for introducing that legislation, and I personally support it.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate and understand your frustration and intolerance when politics is injected into this. What did you think in terms of when, because I heard your opening testimony, what did you need?
There are several things that I need, and I explained the 6 of them in my written testimony. Number one, we truly need to stop criminalizing victims. We need to hold traffickers and buyers accountable. We need to stop criminalizing our victims. We see over 46 states, we said, on a state level have implemented this. But we still need to raise the bar on the state level, and nothing exists on the federal level. We need to implement training for judges who have the power. They have that gateway to get the victims access to the services that they need. Criminalization is not the answer. Victims need access to services to rebuilding their lives. True freedom. We need true freedom. I hear people say all the time, we never want to see you go back to the life. We never want to see you go back to trafficking. Then give us the things that we need to pick up our broken pieces and go confidently after our dreams.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm proud to say in my county, girls, and that's who we're talking about, are not prosecuted, because if you are under the age of consent, how could you possibly be a prostitute? But I have found politically that there is a reluctance to hold the men accountable, a reluctance to hold the Johns accountable. We'll hold the traffickers, but the Johns, we tend to shy away from. Let me thank you so much for your willingness to testify, to come before our committee. And again, let me thank Madam Chair.
Much for your questioning. Now I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Biggs. 5 minutes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sheriff Daniels, I want to know, how are human traffickers, not necessarily drug traffickers or anything else, human traffickers taking advantage of this border crisis in your county?
Well, Ranking Member Biggs, mainly because they're allowed to do it. Let me just say that. And it's been talked about by Ms. Vaughan too, the catch and release. The consequences are not in place. Give you an example, in my section of the state of Arizona, the southeast corner, in the month of February of 2022, we had over 22,000 encounters by Border Patrol and migrants and smugglers. 995 were released back to Mexico. There were 21,000 were released in the country, just catch and release. Then add another 16,000 gotaways, just in my section of the state, which is a small sample of the 31 border counties. We're allowing this. The federal government is allowing this. I call it intellectual avoidance. It's willful neglect. I've said this several times, we got to come together and do a better job, because that citizens and those being trafficked are all victims that we took an oath to share, both the local, state, and federal, and right now we're not collectively doing that. And I agree with Ms. McKenzie. Thank you for saying that. This is not about politics. This is about people. And so it's being allowed, Mr. Biggs.
Thanks, Sheriff. And I think one of the panelists mentioned deterrence. I think you talked about deterrence. We don't have any deterrence when we're releasing people who are actually trafficking in human beings. So that's a bit of a problem. Ms. Vaughan, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the Biden administration has implemented policies concerning unaccompanied children that actually encourages human traffickers to exploit them. Would you elaborate on that for us?
Sure, thank you. This is one of the most serious problems within the dysfunctional system. Through information that you obtained from the Department of Homeland Security, just in the last year or so, 146,000 unaccompanied minors have been released into the country. The current administration, particularly HHS, gives a big illusion of monitoring the well-being of these kids, that they have applications for the sponsors to fill out, that there's legal orientation, post-release phone calls, and so on. But that is an illusion of monitoring. There are no home studies. There are no financial assessments of the ability of the people who come forward to sponsor these kids, that they can actually do it. There are no fingerprints taken. There is no requirement that anyone comply with the requirements of the release of the child to that person. And even the phone calls that they've completed, they tout these post-release phone calls that they make. Even those are worthless for detecting whether someone has been taken into commercialized sex trafficking or even labor trafficking. You can't tell from a phone call what is going on in some of these households. And in a lot of these cases, there are no red flags for the government agencies to pick up on. It's the local law enforcement agencies that detect this, or the service providing agencies that detect it. And sometimes there are sanctuary policies in place also that prevent them from getting in touch with immigration authorities to do something about it. So this is a disgrace, the system that we have, that would not pass muster in any foster care, placement, or child welfare agency in any state in this country, and that's why some of the states are declining to participate, because of the risk to the kids.
So this gets to this cycle that we see. You've got a decrepit foster system where at the federal level, and that leads to what Ms. Alibutto has described as this grooming that takes place, and particularly for foster children who are vulnerable. And that leads to the trafficking that occurs and makes it very difficult to find and prosecute the actual trafficker or rescue the victim. And so I'm glad we're having this hearing, and I think there's actually been some great concrete, and I've read the documents, so I think there's some great concrete proposals here that we want to look at. But in reality, I really like the expungement. In my home state, Arizona, we have an expungement that goes back for quite a long ways. So we tried to make it retroactive. And that needs to happen as well. I appreciate all of your testimony, and this is an important issue, and I'm hoping that we can cross our boundaries that we have here politically and find solutions. And so with that, I'll yield back to you, Madam Chair.
I thank the ranking member very much, and I especially thank each and every one of the witnesses, and to the survivors. Your words, your passion, compassion, your anger and anguish, which is in no way a criticism, but it is welcomed because it is not falling on deaf ears. And I will take the challenge of the ranking member. We can work together bipartisan. There is no reason whatsoever. We do it in Texas. Ms. Alibutto knows that we do that day after day after day. And to Sheriff Daniels, I accept your challenge for comprehensive immigration reform. And I hope the record will reflect, I said Sheriff Daniels. Thank you so very much. We accept your challenge, and I want to make sure that we heard you. I want to introduce some items into the record. I will not ask any questions, but I will just very quickly reiterate that human smuggling is terrible. There are victims. They come individuals who are brought over for many reasons. This hearing was about human trafficking. That should not be in a 21st century nation. It was tragic under the Trump administration that almost 4,000 children were separated from their parents. To date, we are still trying to reunite some of those children with their parents. Some fell into trafficking once separated from parents or guardians. So we know that there is much work to do. What I heard was the issue of criminalizing the victim. We must stop that. The record that a victim has, better work on forced labor, and a big word, the R word, restitution for victims that don't get anything and can't start their life anew. And then, very eloquent story of Ms. Libvac, the Honorable Courtney Libvac, of how she was trafficked at school and how heads were turned and no one wanted to listen. Let us pass H.R. 7566 to heighten the fact that there should be no trafficking in a school zone. So you all have brought different perspectives. I just wanted to emphasize that this hearing touched on what we wanted to focus on. The TVPA, thank you, and as well Anti-Trafficking at School Zones Act to stop and begin. Now we must move to the larger comprehensive package that you've challenged us to do. We must pierce into the depth of what human trafficking is and get away from victimizing, criminalizing, get away from people benefiting from writing books how to do human trafficking. And I guess the point that should be made is the trafficking of human beings. We know what slavery did, and thank you. We must rid ourselves of slavery. What slavery did is move the traders from spices and oils to people. It was much more profitable. Trafficking, you can traffic the victim over and over and over again. So our charge, we accept. The federal government must take a large stand on behalf of all of you. All of you. We must take a big stand on that. I want to introduce into the record, right in our own town of Houston, father of woman who vanished after leaving Houston Strip Club says she's a victim of human trafficking. As unanimous consent, all of these will be submitted without objection. Kidnapped California baby is found. Can you imagine the horrors and what was to happen if this little baby had not been found? DPS arrest 35 in joint human trafficking. That's Department of Public Safety in Texas. Article dated February 4th, 2022. Eastern District of New York, 9 members and associates of nationwide sex trafficking, prostitution enterprise indicted on racketeering and related charges. That's the Eastern District. Now we're down in Maryland, an article indicating that sex trafficking conspiracy member sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. A man sentenced to 10 years for offering to break sex trafficking victim. And that is the Northern District of Texas. As I indicated, there are others dealing with the state of Texas, but we'll add 6 truths about human trafficking in Texas, January 11th, 2022. And then my concluding remarks, again, is a thank you, and then to mention the additional work that Ms. Alibutto has done with Bishop James Dixon in creating human trafficking-free zones around sports facilities as well. And so we can do much of our work together, and I look forward to working with the ranking member on that. With that, this concludes today's hearing. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses, as I said, for attending, but more importantly, for sharing your pain with us, but also sharing your challenge to us. We accept that. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. I thank all the members who participated. We always appreciate your participation in this very important work of this committee. And now the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.